Flying a modern commercial airplane is one of the most complex tasks humans perform. Imagine sitting in a cockpit surrounded by hundreds of buttons, switches, and screens, each one playing a vital role in keeping the aircraft safely in the sky. It's not just about pulling back on the control wheel and taking off like you might see in movies. Today's aircraft are incredible machines where everything is connected. Each system talks to other systems, creating a web of technology that must work perfectly together. But it's not just about the machine, it's about the people too. The pilots, engineers, and ground crew all need to work as one team, communicate clearly, and make the right decisions under pressure. This brings us to the story of Korean Air Cargo Flight 8509. On a cold December night in 1999, a Boeing 747 cargo plane took off from London Stansted Airport. Just minutes later, it disappeared from radar screens and crashed into a field, killing all 4 crew members on board. What makes this accident particularly important is that it wasn't caused by just one thing going wrong. Like many aviation disasters, it revealed deeper problems that existed within the airline industry at the time. Problems with how people worked together, how they communicated, and how different cultures affected the way crews operated in the cockpit. The lessons learned from this tragedy would help shape modern aviation safety and change how airlines around the world operate today. Let's go back to December 22nd, 1999. It was the holiday season, and like many cargo planes, Korean Air Flight 8509 was making a long journey across multiple countries. The aircraft was a Boeing 747, often called the Queen of the Skies, one of the largest and most reliable cargo planes ever built. The journey started in Seoul, South Korea. The first crew flew the massive jet to Tashkent, Uzbekistan, where it landed safely. This was just a stopover. The plane still had to make its final journey to London Stansted Airport in England. At Tashkent, a new crew took over the aircraft. The team consisted of 4 men, Captain Park, who had years of experience flying in the South Korean Air Force. First Officer Yun, who was still relatively new to flying the 747. Flight Engineer Park, and a loadmaster who helped manage the cargo. But something wasn't quite right during the flight from Tashkent to London. One of the plane's important instruments, something called the Attitude Direction Indicator, or ADI, started giving strange readings. Think of the ADI as the artificial horizon that helps pilots know if they're flying level, climbing, or descending. The previous crew noticed this problem, but they found a way to work around it by using a backup system. They made it to London safely, but this small technical issue would turn out to be much more significant than anyone realized at the time. When the plane landed at Stansted, it seemed like just another routine stop. The crew was tired after their long flight, but they followed standard procedures and reported the ADI problem to the maintenance team. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to tragedy just hours later. Think of flying a plane at night or in clouds. You can't see the real horizon outside. This is where the Attitude Direction Indicator, or ADI, becomes a pilot's best friend. It's like having an artificial horizon right in the cockpit, showing if the plane is level, tilting left or right, pointing up or down. Without it, flying in these conditions would be extremely dangerous, maybe even impossible. The Boeing 747 was designed with safety in mind, so it has not just one, but 3 separate ADIs. It's like having 3 backup watches when you're running late for work. If one stops working, you still have 2 others to rely on. Each ADI gets its information from different sources, one from the captain's instruments, one from the first officer's side, and a third backup system called the Inertial Navigation System, or INS. During the flight to London, the captain's ADI started showing wrong information. Imagine looking at your watch, and it says it's midnight when the sun is clearly up. That's how obviously wrong the readings were. The first crew realized this, and did exactly what they were trained to do. They switched to using the third backup system, the INS, which was working perfectly fine. They made a note of the problem and continued their flight safely. The solution seemed simple enough. If one system is giving wrong information, use another one that works. It's like changing the batteries in a broken flashlight. The crew wrote in the plane's logbook that they had switched to using the backup system, called INS-3, and this had solved their problem for the rest of their flight. However, this temporary fix would become part of a much bigger problem. Sometimes in aviation, it's not the broken part itself that causes an accident. It's how people understand and respond to the problem. In this case, the simple act of switching to a backup system would have unexpected consequences when combined with what was about to happen next. When the plane landed at Stansted Airport, ground engineer Kim was waiting to check the reported ADI problem. This should have been a routine maintenance and stop, But several small issues would combine to create a dangerous situation. The first problem was that the maintenance team didn't have the right manual, something called the Fault Dilation Manual, or FIM. Think of it like trying to fix your computer without having the troubleshooting guide. Without this manual, Engineer Kim had to rely on his experience and best judgment to fix the ADI. Kim worked on the system, making what he thought were the necessary repairs. After some basic checks, the ADI seemed to be working normally. He signed off on the repairs, confident that he had fixed the problem. But there was no way to be completely sure without more thorough testing. Then came the handover to the new crew, and this is where things get more complicated. The new team was quite different from the previous one. Captain Park had spent many years in the South Korean Air Force before joining Korean Air. Military pilots are often used to being in complete control and giving direct orders. This would turn out to be important. The first officer, Yun, was relatively new to flying the Boeing 747. In many ways, he was still learning the complexities of this massive aircraft. And while Flight Engineer Park had good experience, the combination of these three men created a specific dynamic in the cockpit. In Korean culture, and especially in Korean companies at that time, there was a strict hierarchy. Junior crew members often felt they couldn't question their seniors, even if they noticed something wrong. This cultural factor, combined with Captain Park's military background and First Officer Yun's inexperience, would prove to be a dangerous mix. The new crew received their briefing about the ADI repair, but something crucial was lost in this handover: the important detail about how the previous crew had successfully used the backup system. Sometimes the most important information isn't what gets fixed, but what worked as a solution before. As the crew prepared for takeoff, problems started almost immediately. The pushback from the gate, usually a simple procedure, became complicated when they had trouble starting one of the engines. These delays might seem minor, but they added to the growing stress in the cockpit. The crew was already running behind schedule on this cold December night. The tension became clear in the way Captain Park spoke to First Officer Yun. Voice recordings from the cockpit would later reveal harsh criticism and sharp commands. When Yun made a small mistake during taxi, the captain's response was severe. Remember the cultural hierarchy we talked about? In this cockpit, it was preventing open communication at a time when it was needed most. Finally, at 1836 local time, Flight 8509 began its takeoff roll down Stansted's runway. The initial climb seemed normal, but then, just 90 seconds into the flight, the ADI problem returned. The captain's instrument was showing the wrong information again, but this time, the response was very different from the previous crews. Instead of switching to the backup system, Captain Park became fixated on his malfunctioning ADI. The plane began to roll to the right. First Officer Yun could see this happening on his own working instruments, but the strict hierarchy in the cockpit made him hesitate to speak up strongly. When he did try to say something, his warnings were too gentle, too polite to break through the captain's concentration on his failed instrument. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Within minutes, the aircraft's right bank became severe, far beyond what any commercial flight should experience. The crew's confusion and lack of coordination became evident in their final moments. Flight Engineer Park called out the bank angle warnings, but there was no clear response from the captain. Just 2 minutes and 31 seconds after takeoff, Korean Air cargo flight 8509 rolled completely to the right and entered a steep dive. The Boeing 747 crashed into a field near the village of Great Hollingbury, just a few miles from the airport. The impact was devastating, and all 4 crew members lost their lives instantly. In those final moments, what we see is not just a technical failure, but a tragic combination of factors: a malfunctioning instrument, cultural barriers that prevented effective communication, and a hierarchical system that made it difficult for junior crew members to challenge their captain's actions. The plane crashed not because it couldn't fly, but because human factors prevented the crew from working together to solve a solvable problem. The crash of Korean Air cargo flight 8509 forced everyone in aviation to take a hard look at how things were done. Korean Air's response went far beyond just fixing technical problems. They knew they had to change their entire company culture. The airline made major changes in how crews worked together, starting with something called Crew Resource Management, or CRM. They think of it as breaking down the walls of hierarchy in the cockpit. They brought in American and European pilots to help train their crews, teaching them that good teamwork is more important than rank. First officers were not just allowed, but required to speak up if they saw something wrong, and captains were trained to listen. The maintenance procedures also saw big changes. No longer could engineers work without proper manuals, and every repair had to be thoroughly tested before a plane could fly again. The airline created clear checklists and procedures that everyone had to follow, no matter how experienced they were. But perhaps the biggest change was in the airline's culture itself. Korean Air worked hard to move away from the strict hierarchy that had made junior crew members afraid to speak up. They created an environment where safety came before saving face, where questioning a superior wasn't seen as disrespect, but as an essential part of safety. These changes didn't just stay within Korean Air. Airlines around the world learned from this accident. They realized that technical skill alone isn't enough. Pilots need to be good communicators and team players. Today, CRM training is standard at every major airline, and cockpit culture emphasizes open communication regardless of rank. The results speak for themselves. In the 25 years since Flight 8509, Korean Air has maintained an excellent safety record. The airline transformed itself from a company that had several accidents in the 1990s to one of the world's safest carriers today. Modern aviation safety standards now recognize that safe flying isn't just about having working instruments or skilled pilots. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels responsible for safety and empowered to speak up. Every time a pilot or crew member anywhere in the world speaks up about a concern, regardless of their rank, they're building on the lessons learned from Flight 8509. This tragedy reminds us that in aviation, as in life, success and safety don't just depend on how well we operate machines, but on how well we work together as human beings. The loss of the crew of Flight 8509 led to changes that have helped protect countless lives in the decades since, making their story an important chapter in the continuing journey toward safer skies for everyone.